Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Power and Utilities webinar on accelerating value creation to understand the long-term effect of short-term decisions, a topic that is very timely with this industry, not only in its response to the COVID pandemic, but also with the recent ramifications from the Texas deep freeze. I'm Chris Peterson. I'm America's governance and long-term value leader for our consulting practice, and I'm delighted today to serve as your moderator. We are eager to discuss key topics on long-term value and ESG stemming from a session we conducted after the last in-person CECP Investor Forum, where we brought together a group of long-term value-minded energy executives for a long-term value summit. After that summit, EY produced a jointly written thought leadership piece with our friends at CECP, which we are looking forward to sharing today. We will also be dialoguing with our amazing panelists what has transpired in this industry over the past year. And of course, with the Biden administration set to invest heavily in climate and environmental justice, and with ESG matters dominating both board agendas and investor strategies, there's never been a more compelling time for power and utility companies to focus on driving long-term value for their stakeholders. I'm joined by a terrific set of speakers today, starting with Brian Tomlinson, Director of Research and the CEO Investor Forum for CECP. Brian's research enables issuers to reorient their disclosures for the long term. His publications provide principles, frameworks, and management approaches for the practice of long-term disclosure and integration of ESG issues. Brian's work on capital markets has been published broadly by Harvard Business Review, Institutional Investor, and the World Economic Forum, to name a few. He has decades of experience as a corporate finance attorney prior to his role at CECP. Next, we have two industry executives, starting with Richard Mcmahon, who is Senior Vice President of Energy Supply and Finance for the Edison Electric Institute, where he leads industry activity on clean energy supply, including natural gas, renewables, and energy storage, plus Wall Street engagement. He is one of the leading voices of the industry to Congress, to regulator agencies and commissions. Previous to EEI, Richard was the founder of EnvironTech Venture Capital Fund, capitalized at $52 million, and before that worked at the NASDAQ. And our second industry executive is Sandy Nessing, Managing Director of Corporate Sustainability at American Electric Power. With 25 years in the utility industry, Sandy manages sustainability strategy, corporate stakeholder engagement, and annual ESG sustainability performance reporting for AEP. She also chairs AEP's Enterprise Sustainability Council and ESG team. Sandy is on point for reporting templates for investors and is also a member of EEI's Customer Solutions Sustainability Subcommittee and leads AEP's participation in the Electric Power Research Institute sustainability programs. And finally, let me welcome my fellow EY partner, Jeff Miller, who leads the Power and Utilities Strategy practice for EY Parthenon in the Americas. Jeff has 25 years of consulting experience for energy and utility companies, helping clients address a variety of strategic and operational challenges to address the disruption facing the industry in terms of decarbonization, decentralization, digitalization, and electrification. His experience spans business unit strategy and operating model design, customer experience, new product development, asset management, mergers, performance management, and org design. So with that, Jeff, let me ask you to please take it from here, and together with Brian, provide a debrief of the thinking coming from the P&U Summit last year. Jeff.
Thanks, Chris. Brian, I would like to welcome everybody to the panel discussion. As Chris mentioned, this panel came together out of a workshop we held back in early 2020, pre-pandemic, where we brought together approximately 10 utilities, EEI, and several analysts from the investor community to talk about the challenges in communicating long-term value to the capital markets. In that session, we discussed how 4 sets of values, financial, human, consumer, and societal can help stakeholder groups assess a company's performance. That workshop outlined 3 key findings, which you'll hear more about as we go through the Q&A with the panel. First, consumer and societal expectations for the decarbonization, decentralization, and digitization of the industry will only increase. We see this not only through the deployment of utility scale and distributed solar and storage across our industry, but also through the sheer volume and nature of sustainability plans that are now being developed. These trends, which have been driven by the combination of technology capabilities and economics, will likely continue to be accelerated through the new administration's environmental justice and climate change plan. Second, long-term investor expectations have shifted, and reporting transparency across a broader set of long-term value drivers and outcomes is influencing investor decision-making. We heard the emphasis on non-financial goals and targets from analysts during our session, and we've also seen that through our research from our climate change and sustainability services practice, that non-financial metrics are increasingly becoming top of mind for investors. Finally, utilities need to control their narrative by ensuring that the strategies address outcomes for key stakeholder groups and relevant long-term value metrics are reported clearly. As an industry focused on delivery of essential services, utilities generally have not done a great job communicating the positive aspects of what we're all doing for customers and employees, be it in terms of affordability, reliability, or sustainability. We view this as a missed opportunity and see the clear measurement and management relative to human, consumer, and societal metrics as a point of increased emphasis. I'd like to turn it over to Brian now.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Good to be with you all this morning. I wanted to pick up just a couple of themes from Jeff's presentation there. One is just rising to the consumer expectations that we see. We talk about this in the paper as consumers having a sort of planet first mindset and being willing to pay more for sustainability in their energy supply. I want to pick up the fact that that essentially relates to broader trends that we see in consumer preferences in other sectors. Where we do see consumers having a higher willingness to pay for products that offer sustainability, and also growth in sustainability-related products, often being the leading brands that companies offer. In a recent paper, we also saw that companies that are associated with pro-social aspects to their brands tend to outperform peer firms who are associated with lower purpose. So, there are real advantages here to companies to meeting these sort of social expectations. That also marries with the importance of meeting the growing investor expectations. Now, lots of different things are driving that. Massive funds flow into sustainability related products. But in our paper here, what we identify are sort of 3 key things that companies need to be doing in response to these broader trends. One is to set out a clear strategy for the energy transition, to adopt uniform and comparable reporting, and to demonstrate real transparency and reporting on their progress going forward. Now, frameworks such as TCFD, SASB, and the great work at EEI, which Richard will talk about, help companies to navigate that landscape. We do also mention in the paper that there are real dangers as ESG moves more and more into the mainstream of being a laggard in this space. You want to avoid those poor ratings. You want to avoid being targeted by investor coalitions. You want to avoid your proxy support ticking down because people have less faith in your progress on ESG themes. So really important not to be a laggard here. And also just to pick up some trends from the changed regulatory space is the report coming out of the Securities and Exchange Commission indicating that the SEC is going to start looking at climate disclosures as sort of part of a bigger and ongoing review of its continuous disclosure framework. So it's something for companies to be very mindful of. And just again, to pick up those non-financial disclosures that Jeff mentioned, to look at things like human capital as being a real focus for investor and indeed regulatory attention. We've seen in the last few years, Human Capital Management Coalition, the Securities and Exchange Commission adjusting Reg SK, investor coalitions targeting EEO1 disclosure. Human capital is really a source of focus. In the paper, we talk about disclosing against, culture and purpose, human capital, and health and well-being, and really trying to improve across all of those three areas. But just a sense here that, companies are really responding to a number of trends, both in terms of social expectations and the regulatory environment, along with obviously the paradigm shift that's going on in energy generation and regulation. But would very much encourage people to engage with the report, as it's built on the expertise of countless professionals like Richard and Sandy. Over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Brian and Jeff, for setting the stage. And we're going to move now into our panel. I will ask the audience, if you do have questions, there's a Q&A spot where you can write in your questions. We'll try to answer them as we can. If not, we will publish unanswered questions with our answers back to you. So use that Q&A function here in Zoom. Let's start in our panel discussion looking at industry impacting megatrends. And I don't think you can start any discussion this year without first looking at COVID impacts. So Richard, for you, COVID, of course, posed many short-term barriers for P&U companies. What strategies are you seeing the industry take during the pandemic in order to preserve strong stakeholder support, both in the short term, but also set the stage for the long term?
Chris, thanks for the question, and it's an honor to participate in the panel with my colleagues and be together again. One clear aspect of the pandemic was that it demonstrated how important a lifeline service our electric service is to the economy in general. The electric service really has enabled this shift that we've made in the economy to the virtual status, to these sorts of meetings, virtual education across the board. So it's been a major enabler. And one thing our industry did at the very beginning of the pandemic was that we pulled together our board, the investor-owned electric utility industry, which is approximately 75% of the industry, and basically agreed to put a moratorium on cutoffs to ensure that this lifeline service continues for everybody. And as the pandemic progressed, utilities then went into a mode of really actively working with their customers so that they can kind of find a way to kind of work out and make sure that the customers' arrearages don't get too large and find a way to work through those things. So I think those things together have been very important. And that kind of gets back to the ESG. It's both a governance aspect and a societal aspect, recognizing how important this lifeline product is and responding. And then the other thing I'll say is that the industry also did an excellent job in confronting the pandemic from an operational standpoint. Putting the safety of our customers and our workers first. So we made sure there was PPE. We're really working to make sure that our crews are safe and making sure that service is good, because despite the pandemic, we also had a year with a lot of storms and a lot of challenges from that perspective. So keeping the service going, not just in the face of those challenges, but in the face of COVID was really a priority for the industry. So I think that is really what our focus was on, sustaining the service that we have for our customers and doing it in a way that they're safe and our crews are safe and the industries can continue to provide this lifeline service.
Great. And Jeff, what else have you seen with other clients in this space? Love Richard's perspective as the energy as an essential lifelong service. What else have you seen, Jeff?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to emphasize the points that Richard made. I think utilities have done a great job in putting both their customers first and their employees first through the pandemic. the ability to work with customers in terms of, through moratoria to flexible payment options, and really helping to engage has been tremendous. And then on the back end, from an employee standpoint, we talk about health and safety, but we also should talk about jobs. I mean, this is a sector that has done very well in terms of making sure that we've maintained and continued to support the capital programs that are in place. And a lot of utility construction work is outsourced, and there's a significant amount of jobs that utilities have been able to maintain through these challenging times. So I think that's a couple areas where we should be able to take credit.
Great. Sandy, anything specific to add from AEP?
Well, I would say that a year ago when we were all together, obviously our focus was long-term, and that's what this is all about, right? But very quickly, it became a very short-term focus as Richard employees, caring for our customers, and cities that really rely on companies like ours. And I think what has happened on the other end of this, and I'm not going to take credit for this, but I heard somebody say this past year that governance and environment, climate were always in the front seat. And because of the pandemic and the social and racial unrest that occurred in 2020, the social piece climbed into the front seat, and now you've got all three coming at you at the same time. So all three of those are extremely important. One's not more important than the other anymore. And on the backside of that, here we are a year into the pandemic, and now we're starting to get that longer term view. And both, Jeff and Brian, you talked about how issues like human capital management, diversity and inclusion, worker health and safety, the customer aspect, all of those things are now becoming long-term issues. We're seeing those issues come up in conversations with investors and with other stakeholders who want to know how you're managing your people and how you're caring for people. And so it's been a really interesting year, but I think our industry has done a really phenomenal job, as Richard said, in really standing up teams to support our customers, doing things. I mean, we actually had a team that was looking at, okay, all the federal funding that was coming out of Washington for small businesses, how can we help our small business customers apply for those funds? So we didn't just sit back and say, oh, there's this CARES Act funding. We actually had a team that was helping them navigate that, figure out how to do it and navigate so they could apply for those funds, because their success is tied to our success, and that's really important. So it's really been quite a year, and it's really kind of flipped how we think about ESG, I think, on its head a little bit.
Great. And the other craziness of the year are the recent events in Texas, where, of course, frigid temperatures knocked out almost 50% of Texas's power plants in mid-February, leaving more than 4 million people without heat or light for days, plus bursting water pipes that damaged many businesses and residents. And just yesterday, I saw that grid provider Brazos Electric Power Co-op is filing for bankruptcy protection. We have found that climate change in the industry isn't just about carbon reduction, but it's also about the need for technology change as well to ensure another Texas catastrophe doesn't happen. Richard, for you, what else are we learning from the industry in things like the Texas crisis? What changes will the industry continue to make?
Well, Chris, you've made some great points. Obviously there's still ongoing investigations, but, we do know that, the different, looking at the different fuels, none of them perform perfectly during this cold snap. And I think that, Texas is normally what we would call a summer peaking region. That part of the country is normally a summer peaking region. And so having the peak occur in the winter is not only unusual, but it was not just a peak, but it was a record peak. So, I mean, basically the systems are engineered for something, for these historic normal weather patterns that we've seen. And then we're seeing things that are, much more severe storms and much more frequent storms. And then we're also seeing different weather patterns. So essentially the system was designed for a summer peak, and you had this winter peak occurring. So basically I think first and foremost, we have this probably the industry's best, any industry, the best mutual assistance program there is. But as these weather events become larger and regional, that's a challenge, because big swaths of the country, I mean, really the whole middle continent of the country was impacted by that cold snap. So that is an issue. I think, generally speaking, it's always good to have some fuel diversity, but, we're looking at the issue of sort of resilience investment, adaptation investment, hardening investment. And, you need to look at the entire fuel chain. So you need to look at from where the fuel is sourced all the way through the transmission and distribution of the fuel all the way through, and determine whether there's really opportunities. I think there are opportunities to build greater resilience into those systems. During the last vortex, we saw different fuels perform differently. So it really, I think it's really about recognizing that we're seeing increasingly severe and more frequent storms. So they're not once every 100-year type storms. They're more frequently than that. And so you need to really build greater resilience into the system. So I think that's going to be a dialogue that we have with investors, with stakeholders, with regulators, to really bring about that greater resilience, because essentially, as I think Jeff said at the top, I mean, the expectation is we're going to deliver sustainable, reliable, and affordable service. All three of those things. That's what the customers want.
Richard, take us into what happened. So we had, different fuel sources that didn't perform. And then we also now have many customers with these gigantic bills, right? So can you give us another depth underneath both the fuel failure and then what happened in terms of the charging?
Well, I think that, you saw, I mean, it's a variety of things. Obviously, the ERCOT market is a primarily Texas only market. And then within that, there are market design issues that you don't have a capacity market. It's an energy only market. So you got those attributes. And then there's certain levels that the prices can rise in those markets based purely on supply and demand issues. So we saw that at play. And we also saw the fact that certain generation was offline, either for maintenance reasons or for the fact that this cold snap impacted the ability of that generation to actually deliver power into the grid. So, I mean, it was really a variety of things. It wasn't just one thing, but some of these aspects I think can be addressed. And again, I think there's still a lot of analysis to go in this issue, but I think a lot of these things, can be addressed by looking at the opportunities to make the entire fuel chain and power chain more resilient in the face of what we're seeing are more extreme weather conditions happening a lot more frequently than before. And again, this is a record peak occurring in the winter in a region of the country that is normally a summer peaking area. So, I mean, I think it's going to be a variety of things. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about the market design issues. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about needed capital expansion. Again, I think they do have fuel diversity in the Texas market. And there's a lot of other issues at play there too. But I mean, there's not just one thing. I guess that's the bottom line that we can see at this.
But a learning opportunity for others.
Sure.
So figure this out, and next time we have this vortex, we're in better shape to pull through. Sandy?
Yeah, I was just going to underscore, what Richard said, in that as we address climate change and we move forward, I think one of the key lessons coming out of Texas is that, and Richard hit on it, this transition is already well underway, but the pace of it is going to be really important. And it has to be, at the center of it has to be reliability, resilience, and affordability. those things are critical to moving forward and meeting our climate goals. And so I think we're going to learn a lot of lessons. I think we already have out of what's happened in Texas. But I think it's taught us that those three things have to be at the heart of our transition.
Thank you. And the other mega trend, of course, is the new Biden administration, another major change driver. And Jeff, from an industry perspective, what growth drivers and barriers to scale are you expecting as Biden rolls out new climate-related regulation?
So we see the pillars of the Biden plan are around fossil fuel environmental justice, resilient infrastructure, global obligations, are net zero and 100% clean energy by 2050, and transitioning the workforce. I'd expect that investments and the potential for incentives will be significant around the environmental justice agenda, particularly in terms of making sure that all individuals have access to renewable energy. And that means continued deployment, expansion of community solar programs and microgrid projects, increased support for climate resilient infrastructure, as Richard and Sandy just described, really coming from situations like what we're just experiencing in Texas. That being said, the barriers to scale are really technology driven, and we'd expect to see significant R&D investments. And that goal of 100% clean energy by 2050, right now the technology doesn't support that, and there needs to be a lot of investments for us to figure out how do we get there. And the industry is going to be front and center in defining how that takes place.
So we have technology limitations, but on the other hand, the market is really pushing the industry there, right? So you've got a new level of consumer and societal sentiment and expectations for ESG and decarbonization for the industry. And consumer sentiment is moving to what Brian mentioned earlier in his remarks, this planet first mindset. What best practices do you see in the industry to set targets that satisfy stakeholder demands?
So, EY published a 2020 consumer sentiment survey in which we really talked about 5 main segments of future customers. And from largest to smallest, they were built around affordability, health, planet, which is front and center in the paper, society, and experience. Interestingly, the planet and society portions cover about 1/3 of the respondents, and the planet first customers pay much more attention to the environment. They shop local. They pay more for sustainable products bought from companies that demonstrate their values, and that's a very significant and ongoing trend that we're seeing. That planet first also, they don't necessarily skew to any sort of demographic cohort. They're spread across all income groups. And over 90% of adults say that they're influenced by concern about sustainability. So that number, it continues to increase and actually got over 90% in our 2020 survey. So that's an interesting dynamic, even when you compare that to the percentage that actually look at how do they prioritize sustainability relative to other purchasing criteria. So affordability is obviously still front and center in terms of what everybody is looking at. So that being said, when we look at age as a barometer, we definitely see that 18 to 44 age bracket as being much more interested in buying sustainable products. But what that means for our industry is that we need to both articulate strategies and perform some level of self-promotion, communicate the activities that utilities are taking to transition to clean fuels, to better serve customers, embrace D&I, and build out that future workforce.
It's interesting, the power of the social sentiment. And, Sandy, you mentioned S is in the back seat. Now it's jumping in the front seat with E and G, which I love that analogy. So we don't have any backseat drivers. We have everybody in the front seat equally. And so along with the social sentiment, the consumer sentiment that Jeff just mentioned, Sandy, what else do you see around the S? So take us a little bit deeper there. How is the S playing out and changing what you're thinking about at AEP?
Yeah, it's been quite a year. I think the real focus has been on people, and we talked about that earlier. I see a lot of, and I hear a lot and read a lot and know what's going on, but the whole notion of human capital management is just so big. And it's not, it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what does that mean? And how transparent are companies around some of these issues? Safety and health, we've always reported on that. It's incredibly important to our industry. But all of a sudden it's like a top of mind issue, and it's part of human capital management, because companies perhaps are having to think about it in new ways that they hadn't thought about it before. For us, it was natural. It was just another way that we protect our employees out in the field or in the office. So I see a lot more on those issues, and it's going deeper. So what I feel is that I'm bringing people to the table to have conversations with investors who have never been at that table before. So bringing like your chief HR officer, or sometimes, you might have to bring somebody from risk to talk about certain things, but bringing issues and having those conversations. We had a conversation with a fixed income investor a few weeks ago, and they told us it would be an ESG discussion, and boy, was it. There was climate, there was diversity and inclusion, there was safety, you name it, it was all there. And I think companies are, and I can speak for AEP, really taking this, really going deep on it and trying to understand, what does that look like in the future? Where do we go? What's that roadmap look like? We're in the process of updating our D&I roadmap so that it's DE&I, and looking at 2025 and really looking at, stretching ourselves. So not just what does our workforce demographics look like, and what does our board diversity look like, but how do we really reflect the labor pool from which we're drawing, and also the communities that we serve. So looking deeper at what those things mean. And I think that's where this is going. I think we're going to see a lot more social issues continue to come up. They are super, super important. They come up on governance calls, they come up with investor calls, and the board's also very, very interested in these issues, and where are we going and how are we managing those things.
So a different dialogue from investors for US, heavily focused on human value, and all the elements there getting into the front seat. Brian, with your investor lens on, Sandy's talking about the different ESG elements that investors care about, but let's maybe move back to the megatrends we talked around energy transition. And obviously that's a very important topic. Sandy, I'm sure at AEP, the analysts were all over you for that. Brian, what's the best way for P&U players to dialogue about the transition, that longer carrot, but what should they be doing now in the interim to talk about their movement to a cleaner fuel source?
Yeah, happily, I think there's a lot more reporting infrastructure to support the conversation around decarbonization. So, in recent years, obviously, we've had the development and dissemination of the TCFD framework. Now, that provides companies with quite a usable, off-the-shelf kind of basic framework for talking about how climate relates to your governance story, your strategy story, and obviously to also engage with this emerging practice of scenario analysis. So, and you've seen the uptake of that increase with investor pressure and the acknowledgement that this isn't really a kind of bullet that you can dodge. But I think I wanted to pick up kind of three key things I think that companies need to do. It is important to set those long-range targets. We've heard about the importance of getting to net zero and 2050. Now, the question then is, how are you going to get there? And ultimately, what you need to do is to have a very clear guide path of sequential GHG reduction goals that get you to 2050. Just having a 2050 number isn't really going to cut it. You know, I mean, I think of a sort of, you know, personal example that, you know, if I was to tell someone that I was trying to run a sub 3-hour marathon, someone might want to know what my mile splits are along the way. And if the first mile's taken me half an hour, then, you know, that sub 3-mile marathon is looking less possible. So I think, you know, it's just about providing those short, medium, and long-term targets to provide a glide path to 2050. As part of that, obviously, you have to have an aligned CapEx story, and to provide investors with a reasonable basis for matching what your CapEx is to your targets over time. And are those credible? Do those match up? Is there a plausible business rationale underlying them? And then a third issue, and I think this is an issue which is really important in terms of optics and reputation and credibility, is also this issue of overall alignment of your goals with your broader policy stance. Really important for companies to, you know, if you're committed to 2050, to then also be supporting to not be supporting industry bodies, for instance, that are essentially sort of opposed to the policy stance that might get you collectively to 2050 as a whole. You've seen various investor coalitions approach that, and you've seen some sort of pushback, but overall you've now seen a lot more disclosure about, you know, who people are funding and why, and some companies kind of withdrawing funding for third-party organizations who are clearly, you know, not supportive of the goals outlined. So I think, you know, it's just really important, provide the roadmap and have alignment on use of capital and alignment on, you know, what you're saying and what you're doing.
So interesting, and the, you know, guideposts as you go, and you know, Richard, you've reminded me that the industry is keen to transform, but it's the pace of change that companies differ around. So Richard, jump in here on the pace of change, and how do we, again, take note of the resiliency, the reliability, and the affordability on the path?
Sure. So let's start with the fact that utilities and EEI members are leading the transition to the lower carbon energy economy in the US, and even compared to most countries in the world. You know, and our template, by the way, is a great way that they're able to communicate that story. If you look at 2019 compared to 2005, we've reduced CO2 by 45%. And we're on a trajectory that by 2050, it'll be at least 80%. So our industry has leaned into this. Most every one of our companies pretty much have laid out 2030, 2050 goals, really assertive goals. And so, you know, again, I mean, I think that we're really leaning in. And also I'd point out to the fact that electrification really should be looked at not just sector by sector, but economy wide. Because if you look at, you know, there's sectors where there's low hanging fruit, like transportation, for example. If you electrify transportation, that and take that economy-wide approach, there are huge gains to be made in terms of, you know, economy-wide carbon reductions. And the utilities will be, and electric companies are going to be main players in that, because we're going to be helping to implement the infrastructure to make that happen. So I think those things are all things to consider. But I'd say again, you know, as you decarbonize, and I think it was Jeff or Brian that mentioned this earlier, you know, there's a line of sight to get to certain levels of decarbonization right now. And we've already achieved pretty much more than anybody in terms of decarbonization. But, you know, there's technology that needs to come down the pike to get to those really high goals of 80, 90, net zero, those sorts of goals. And so R&D is needed. We need R&D in hydrogen. We need improvements in battery storage. I mean, there's lots of different opportunities. And I think that, but, you know, now's the time to invest in that R&D that can yield those benefits down the road. But in the meantime, there is a good trajectory and a line of sight to continued real reductions in carbon. And our industry has really probably leaned in more than about any other industry, because we've laid out our goals 2030, 2050, and we're the pretty much the only industry with our own ESG sustainability template where you can compare everybody against one another. So I think it's very important, as was said. I think it's important to our customers, our investors, our regulators, and our companies to get this done.
If I could just add, Chris, real quick, something that Richard touched upon, and that is, how integral our industry is to making that transition and working with other sectors. So just about 25 or 30 minutes ago, AEP, Dominion, Duke, Entergy, Southern, and TVA just announced the formation of the Electric Highway Coalition. So basically what we're doing is we're getting together and saying, our service territories touch each other. Let's develop a long distance EV corridor, and which is what will help to accelerate adoption of electric vehicles, because, everybody's got range anxiety. Everybody's afraid that their battery's going to die. So here, is a group of utilities saying, look, we can make a difference. We can do this, and we can be part of that longer term solution. And that's the kind of thing that we need to do. And that's what our industry is leading on.
That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And I guess just a question back to Richard on that Highway Coalition, which is brand new. What role will an EEI play in helping frame that type of a coalition? What's the power of the associations in this emerging industry, Richard?
Well, I mean, we're here to amplify the great work that our companies are doing. I mean, I think that, another great aspect of our trade association is that it's an opportunity for our senior leaders to get together, share best practices. And, obviously electric transportation and electric vehicle deployment is a key priority for the industry and I think the economy. So I think that these sorts of best practices that companies like AEP are putting out there are something that, others will look to replicate. So I think it's very important to promote it, but also to kind of spread the word on these sorts of great best practices.
And our vision would be that this goes national, right? So it's not just limited to the utilities that kick this off, but, to all the other utilities, come join us. I mean, that's the power of what EEI can help us do.
Great. Very, very interesting and very timely example. So thank you. And Brian, back to you. When we're looking at these kinds of investments companies are making to do good in the world, to make a difference. We talked about how to discuss and disclose energy transition, but help us understand broader disclosure on the other ESG topics. What best practices are we seeing? What do investors want to hear? What guidance do you have for this industry when they're disclosing their good works in these different categories?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. And I think in many ways, the work that EEI has done in this space is work that could very usefully be done in other sectors. Because essentially what we're seeing on ESG is about sort of turning ESG from something that's kind of been a siloed conversation, often buried in kind of a corporate sort of social responsibility discourse, but hasn't really been connected to that key financial and strategy and kind of business model conversation. So I think what we're doing here is essentially saying there are elements of that sustainability story that are actually absolutely key, as this conversation suggests, to long-term financial performance and everything that kind of underlies it. So I think the EEI sort of framework provides a fantastic kind of way of getting to a very high baseline of smart ESG disclosure. And, I think, again, to sort of talk about the broader reporting infrastructure that we see here, something like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board does provide a relatively stable basis in other sectors also for companies to get to that high minimum baseline of smart ESG disclosure, to basically say, these are the key elements of our ESG story that are impacting our financial performance and our prospects. And essentially, again, sort of converting this story towards an investor audience. Now, all of that also involves significant, behind the scenes operational work that, Sandy can talk about in great detail, about making sure that the conversation on ESG is unsiloed within the organization. Now, there are lots of different ways that companies can sort of start unsiloing ESG. A couple of simple steps that companies can take. One is to simply convene an ESG working group, which is essentially to convene the internal ecosystem of the company, work out who owns what data, what are we disclosing, where and why, with what rationale, and to what extent is that actually meeting, the investor expectations that we're hearing in different forums. And that sort of unsiloing is actually going in really interesting directions at quite a rapid pace. It's been mentioned how the COVID has kind of taken the messy middle of the ESG spectrum, the S in ESG, and really sort of elevated its significance. And this year we saw, volumes of S issues, actually being talked about in the quarterly earnings call. Now, it's been hard enough to get ESG into that quarterly call context for all sorts of reasons about periodicity of data, analyst appetite, is the information comparable? Are we at the stage of maturity to share it, and so on, across the ESG piece? But actually, you've had this sort of sudden elevation of S issues. And of course, if you're talking about it in the context of the earnings call, you have to be talking about it in a way that makes sense when you're talking about strategy, reputation, performance, and so on. And that's really encouraging. I actually saw a stat the other day which indicated that if you look at earnings call transcripts, if you do a word search on, say, ESG and a word search on DEI, you see between 2018 and 2020 sort of 600, 700% increases in references in earnings call transcripts. So, something's clearly in the waters. There's pressure to push the information out. There's pressure to get the information for investors. And I think all of that is helping to sort of over time merge these what have been somewhat parallel narratives between, the conventional financial discourse and the sustainability discourse. And I think the fact that we're having this conversation indicates that conversation is now merging quite rapidly.
Brilliant, brilliant. And in this industry, Richard, any best practices you're seeing on earnings calls, best practices that the industry is making and how they disclose to analysts? What are you seeing?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One, some of our companies, I think in most cases, you're going to see ESG as part of their earnings calls. It's just embedded into it now. And we've actually seen several examples of companies that have done ESG only types of events where they really focus on those aspects with the investors. Looking at what we have done at EEI with leaders like Sandy involved is that, first we started with a board level concurrence that this was a priority more than 4 years ago. And our board consists of all the CEOs of the investor-owned utilities. And then we have executives from the industries come together. And we actually, our idea was to really focus our template around the investor needs first and foremost, and then bring in others. And we meet with investors, this investor group, and we've actually expanded to include other stakeholders. I mean, we have, the raters, we have SASB, CDP, other groups like that participate. The proxy advisory firms, for example, participate with us. So we meet with investors twice a year before proxy season and after proxy season, and we get their input. So we want to know, and we evolve the template that way. I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked, we've sort of alluded to it, but we really haven't said it, is that ESG is not a defined set concept. It's an evolving concept. And so that's what makes it sometimes a little bit more difficult unless you have a template to start with that you can kind of evolve with what the investors' interests are. And yet in our case, the one thing we have learned from our engagement is that they want it concise, comparable, and present it in a format where, you know, they can really, it gives them the most pertinent information. So we're not looking to just keep adding more and more to the template and make it bigger, because that would stray from what the investors have really hammered us with, that they wanted it to be concise. But we have tried to address issues that have come up, like, for example, cyber governance. That's an issue that's critically important to the industry. We have industry level initiatives, and the companies are all extremely focused on it. But normally, in terms of disclosures, you're only going to disclose if you have kind of a material breach. And so if you're not talking about it, then the idea is, well, maybe what's going on there. So that was an information gap that we addressed. And as Sandy talked about, DE&I is also an emerging gap that maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there wasn't as high of an interest we were hearing when we started our template. It was much more focused on the environment piece. So it's an evolving concept. I think you need a mechanism for getting investor feedback to make sure that you're hitting the mark with your template or your ESG disclosure. And we really put a lot of focus on that and get a lot of feedback and a lot of interaction. And that's how we do it. And it's worked out pretty well.
And I can't say enough about that. And I know I speak for my peers in the industry, how valuable that is to us to get that feedback and have that interaction with that investor group twice a year. Because I remember, you know, I've been with this since the beginning. And I remember when we first met and we came up with a laundry list of metrics, and we thought, oh, they're going to want this. And they're like, oh my God, no, you know,
Right.
let's keep it short and simple. And so, you know what, they help us to focus on what is decision useful for them. And that's critical, which gets back to materiality, right? And what's really relevant. And that helps us to stay focused.
And Sandy, you know, coming back full circle to how Jeff opened our discussion, he talked about the summit we had. We dug into, you know, the industry members' points of view on the 3 non-financial drivers of value, right? You've talked a lot about human value. We also talked about consumer value. We've talked a lot about societal value as well. Has anything shifted this year beyond what you've talked about heavily in human that we should know about, and you know, or other things on AEP in your minds as you continue to evolve the metric set? Again, the materiality is key. We've got to make sure we're communicating what investors want to hear, but beyond that, what leading metrics do we want them to hear that needs to be part of the disclosure?
Yeah, oh gosh. First of all, transparency, the expectation there is higher than it's ever been. And it goes into issues that, you know, we kind of skim the surface on in the past, but now the expectation is open up the curtain and show us inside. You know, there are a couple things going on from an activist perspective that I think bear watching, because it helps us to understand what our stakeholders are really looking for. So one of them is the Say on Climate, which is a UK hedge fund that has, you know, is pushing this advisory vote by investors to basically vote on your climate plan. And they want companies to present that as part of the proxy. And it's kind of like Say on Pay, but it's really on climate. And what that tells me is that we can be more transparent and talk about, as you said, Brian, tell us those milestones along the way. That's what people really want to know. How do you think you're going to get there? Nobody has the answers, right? I mean, 2050 is what, 30 years away? We don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of uncertainty there. But if we can kind of say, okay, we can see a path if these other things come into play, I think that's what people are really looking for. And they want to know that it's on your radar. They want to know that it's top of mind, and that you are managing it, you know, and not just somebody like me, but the board is involved, you know, that is really important for stakeholders to know. So, you know, the metrics are changing all the time, what people are looking for, but I think the key is transparency. I hear that on diversity and inclusion as well. I was part of a roundtable a a couple months ago with a bunch of Fortune 500 companies, and I was really shocked at how little disclosure there is on diversity, workforce diversity. I think companies do a pretty good job because they really are being pushed in that regard on the board diversity piece. But workforce diversity is something that is, and that really surprised me. And so what's happening in the absence of that disclosure, organizations are saying, well, there's an EEO1 report, so why don't we just publish that? And maybe that's not the right, that may not be the right approach. So we've got to step in and help to influence and shape what those metrics are going to look like, leading, how do we want to lead on this? And that's an opportunity for us. And that's a classic example of where, investors, research organizations, they don't know how to measure this. They're looking for some help and some guidance. And absent that, they're going to migrate to EEO1 reports. And companies are very, very reluctant on that. So I see, the opportunity is there for us to be part of the conversation, to shape and to influence, and then to be transparent. I mean, that's critical, I think. And I think we heard that, from all of us here, today, how important that is. I'm always amazed every year. I'm a geek. I look at all the shareholder proposals, because it's a way to know what's, trends, emerging issues, but also I'm always shocked at how many proposals are brought forward just to get a company to report anything. That shocks me every single year that there are shareholder proposals just to force a basic sustainability report.
Tell us something. Tell us something.
Yeah, tell us something.
Yeah.
And, and that goes back to, you have the story, you have the strategy, you own it. Tell the story. That's the thing. You can't just tell it once. You have to tell it over and over and over. And you've got to give that broader view, that longer term view. And that's the opportunity we have. If you're not doing it, it's a missed opportunity, I think.
Well, this has been an amazing discussion, and we're going to hit the what I love to call the lightning round. So I'd love every panelist just in 30 seconds to tell us your best piece of advice you can give your peers out there on the call on how they should best build and demonstrate long-term value. So Jeff, starting with you.
Gotta go off mute. So I come back to discipline in planning and transparency. I thought Sandy did a really nice job emphasizing that point. Developing goals that address all the different value levers. It's about the combination of societal, human, customer, and financial goals, and highlighting the right financial goals. Then measuring and managing to those goals and communicating progress. While maintaining pace across that is challenging, the transparency around measuring and managing performance demonstrates progress to investors more than anything else.
Great. Thank you. Richard.
Thanks, Chris. I would just say that in our sector, it really helps that our companies, that first of all, that at the senior most levels, our companies engage in EEI, and we have executives like Sandy involved in our ESG activity. And I think having a shared vision and being able to leverage your trade association is really, really a powerful way to make a difference. And, with our relationships with the members and the financial community, that's been critically important. The other point I just want to put out there is that, and we alluded to it a little bit in the Texas discussion, is I suspect that in ESG and E part, there's going to be more attention paid in the future to the hardening adaptation and resilience aspects. Our industry is investing $140 billion a year in CapEx as of 2020. And we're already doing that, but I think there's going to be more of a focus on bringing that forward. How much, how is that investment happening, and all those things. So we're really actively engaged in that dialogue.
Great. Sandy?
I would say that if you don't have an ESG team in your company, you need one. That's something that I put together a couple of years ago. It's the best thing I've ever done. I have risk management, enterprise risk management, treasury, legal from a governance perspective, investor relations, environmental, communications, and diversity and inclusion we just added this year as well. But that is the core team. We see what's going on. We see to collectively, we're able to manage it. And from there, it gets embedded in strategy, and then it becomes part of that broader story. So to me, that you just need you need a group like that. We've been working together, for a couple of years, and it has been phenomenal. I've learned a lot about other parts of the company where I didn't think ESG was a risk, and it is, and vice versa. So highly recommend that.
Great. And Brian?
I would strongly suggest that companies imitate Sandy, which is to take that ESG ecosystem, put it in a room on a monthly, quarterly, whatever appropriate period, and make sure you know what you're doing, what's going on, who needs to talk to who. Make sure corporate sustainability and investor relations are best friends forever. That will do your company a world of good. And that sort of operational process steps will then put you in a position where you can set targets and give your investors an opportunity to reward you for meeting them.
Great. And I guess my big takeaways from this discussion are 4 things. First, it's not just an energy transition, it's a technology transition for the industry. It's about transparency and reporting. It's about an unsiloed ESG team. And my best takeaway, it's S jumping in the front seat with E&G. So with those big themes and thoughts, thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience members. It's been a great dialogue, and we look forward to being with you again in the future. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks all. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.